Hello everyone, I am Stefani Kalli, a fifth-year medical student at First Faculty of Medicine, Charles University, and today I will be teaching you this topic as part of the Neuroanatomy course. It is called motor pathways in the spinal cord. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's a very important pathway component of the spinal cord, so let's get started. On this slide, you can find a summary of the content of this video presentation. We will start with a diagram of all the spinal cord pathways to give you a general idea of what information and what structures you can find in the spinal cord. Then we will look at a picture which represents the descending, i.e. the motor spinal cord pathways, so that we focus better on the main topic of this presentation. Then we will go on and talk about the complete course of the motor spinal cord pathways, because it's very important for you to understand that even though the topic of the presentation is motor spinal cord pathways, clearly the neurons that constitute this specific spinal cord pathway, they are starting their course somewhere else outside the spinal cord, and they're finishing their course somewhere else again outside of the spinal cord. So we want to look at their complete course. And then we will look in detail at the complete course of the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract, because the motor spinal cord pathways are basically two, the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tracts. So after we look at them together, we will look at them in detail one by one. Then we'll talk about the motor homunculus, as it has a very important role to play in these pathways. And then we will look at the cross section of the spinal cord and a histological slide, just to familiarize yourselves with how histological slides of the central nervous system look like, as you will have a lot of these as part of your neuroanatomy course. And then we'll talk about some lesions of the spinal motor pathways to give you an idea of the most important pathologies that you will come across as medical students and as doctors. Please do not stress out if the details feel like they're too many. Obviously, the details of this part of the presentation are not required for you to know, for you to pass your exam. They're just there to give you an idea of the main clinical correlates, and also for you to have, in case you want to come back to it in a few years' time and revise the whole topic as As promised, our first picture involves all spinal cord pathways. As you can see on the right hand side, as you're looking at the screen, we have the blue tables which involve the ascending pathways. That involves information going from the periphery through the spinal cord up to the brain. This is not the focus of our presentation. You will talk about that in a different part of the neuroanatomy course. And then on the left, you can see the red table, and it involves the descending eye motor pathways. That means the neurons in these pathways, they are transferring information from the brain down the spinal cord and to the periphery. Clearly, descending is equivalent to motor pathways, because the information carried by these neurons is involving motor activity. So the brain will instruct the body on how to move in a specific way. Let's say you want to pick up a pencil and write. This information needs to start from the cortex. It will be modified by some other components of the brain, and then the information will come down the spinal cord and go to the skeletal muscles. Specifically, as you can see, we have the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. We will talk further about these two on the next slide, where we will have removed the ascending pathway so that the picture is more clear for you guys. On this slide, you can find another picture of the spinal cord. Specifically, it is a cross-section diagram of the spinal cord with focus on the descending spinal cord pathways. Obviously, descending spinal cord pathways, once again, they are the motor spinal cord pathways, and we have two of them, the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. Let's focus a bit on each one individually. Let's start with the lateral corticospinal tract. As you can see, it is located in the posterior half of the cross-section of the spinal cord, and it is surrounded by the posterior horn, the intermediate horn, and it is found behind the lateral spinothalamic tract, which is an ascending pathway. As you can see, there is also a specific arrangement of the neurons transferring information from specific parts of the brain to specific parts of the musculoskeletal system in that lateral corticospinal tract. What do I mean? You can see that on the lateral most part of the lateral corticospinal tract we have a label saying sacral, and then in the most medial part of this tract we have a label saying cervical. These refer to the parts of the spinal cord. As you know, we have cervical components of the spinal cord, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and then information from this part of the spinal cord will give out our spinal nerves and then our peripheral nerves, which will innervate specific skeletal muscles. So it's very important for you to remember, as part of neuroanatomy and also later on as part of your physiology and pathology, that the neurons that are found most laterally, they're transferring information to the lower limbs. So even more specifically, the most lateral neurons will be transferring information from specific parts of the brain to your toes. And then as you move from most laterally to most medially, in this pathway in the spinal cord, you will find neurons transferring information further and further up in the body. So we're starting with the toes in your foot, then muscles that move the ankle, the calf muscles, the thigh muscles, muscles of the gluteal region, and then we go to the upper limb where you would find muscles moving your fingers, then your wrist, your forearm, and your upper arm. Okay, so that's the arrangement. And a mnemonic that can help you to remember that is that in the lateral corticospinal tract, the lateral neurons transfer information to the legs. So there is 3 L's. Lateral corticospinal tract, lateral part of it, legs. Okay, I hope this makes sense. It's a little detail, but it is important. And then let's move on to the anterior corticospinal tract. As you can see, this one doesn't have such an arrangement specified because it is not so important. The important thing that you have to remember about the anterior corticospinal tract is that it is responsible for bringing about and facilitating movement of muscles of the core. That means muscles of the neck, of the shoulders, and the back, your axial muscles. So they help with posture, they help with bending, with straightening up your shoulders, etc. Okay, so these are the details that you need to remember for these tracks right now. Let's move on and better understand them. I would like to make an additional clarification. When I was mentioning the different parts of the spinal cord and I mentioned the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, I forgot to say that there is a coccygeal part, which is the most lower one. And the reason is that it is not so important for the motor spinal cord pathways because this part of the spinal cord, in fact, even though it does give a single spinal nerve, the components of this nerve, the neurons inside these nerves, in this nerve, they do not transfer motor information. They transfer solely sensory information. That's why in the label, in this diagram, you do not see a coccygeal section because if there was one, it would be the most lateral one. Yeah, I hope that makes sense and it clarifies any misunderstanding regarding the parts of the spinal cord and what spinal cord nerves come out of it, because there is a coccygeal part and there is one coccygeal spinal nerve. On this slide, we will talk about some further details about the differences between the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. You have a little note there which mentions the detail I talked to you about on the previous slide, the fact that the lateral corticospinal tract controls limb movement while the anterior corticospinal tract controls trunk, neck, and shoulder movement. But other than this functional arrangement, there is also an anatomical arrangement that differentiates the two tracts between them. And this is what we will mention on this slide. The diagram which I have added is facilitating this very important difference for your understanding. Okay, let's see. You can see that the corticospinal tract starts from the precentral gyrus and then the neurons descend, down the brain through the cerebral peduncle, which is found in the midbrain, and then further down in the medulla, and that is where some of the neurons of the corticospinal tract will decussate. What does that mean? They will cross from right to left and from left to right. So if you have neurons starting from the right part of the brain, from the right cerebral hemisphere, specifically from the right precentral gyrus, and they're descending along the right part of the brain, along the right midbrain, right pons, right medulla, then at the lower part of the medulla they will cross to the left side and they will be traveling down the left half of the spinal cord. And the same applies for the neurons starting from the left cerebral hemisphere, from the left precentral gyrus, going down the left midbrain, pons, and medulla, and at the lower part of the left medulla they will cross to the other side and they will now be descending down the right half of the spinal cord. So this decussation, it is called the pyramidal decussation, and the neurons that do this crossing, that do decussate, that do change sides, they're the neurons that will later on form the lateral corticospinal tract. Whereas the neurons that do not decussate, because it's important to remember that not all neurons which are part of the corticospinal tract decussate, the ones that do not change from left to right or from right to left, and they keep on traveling from the right side of the brain through the right side of the spinal cord. So they're constantly at all points in the central nervous system on the right half. They will later on give rise to the anterior corticospinal tract. So this is an anatomical difference between the lateral and anterior corticospinal tract. The fact that the neurons inside the lateral corticospinal tract, they are in fact coming from the right side if we're talking about the left lateral corticospinal tract, and if we're talking about the right lateral corticospinal tract, the neurons that make it up come from the left side of the body. However, we have two anterior corticospinal tracts, the left anterior corticospinal tract and the right anterior corticospinal tract, and neurons that are found in the right anterior corticospinal tract are coming from the right precentral gyrus, while the neurons found in the left anterior corticospinal tract are coming from the left precentral gyrus. So this is the anatomical difference. What does it mean in terms of function? What's the functional implication? What's the physiological implication? It basically means that the right lateral corticospinal tract, which is controlling right leg and right upper limb, the information for it are coming from the left side of the body. Whereas the right anterior corticospinal tract, which is controlling the right side of the core, has information coming from the right precentral gyrus, from the right half of the brain. Okay, so it's very important for you to understand that the left part of the limbs is controlled by the right side of the brain, whereas the left part of your core muscles are controlled by the left half of the brain. I hope this makes sense, because it is anatomically, physiologically, and pathophysiologically very important in case you have lesions at any part of this pathway. On this slide, we will talk about the complete course of the lateral corticospinal tract. It is a summary, so a lot of the facts have already been mentioned on the previous slide, but we will talk about them again because repetition always helps with understanding, and we will add a few more details. So, the table starts with the titles on the top and then the information at the bottom. Let's look at the first part, descending tract. Basically, we're mentioning which descending tract are we talking about. We're talking about the lateral corticospinal tract. Obviously, we have two, the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tracts. Then function. What is its function? It is the voluntary movement of the contralateral limbs, as we already mentioned. And then we go on to look at where we will find the first order neurons of this pathway. An important concept for you to understand before we go on to the details is first order and second order neuron. A pathway can be made up of one neuron, such as some spinal reflex pathways. It can be made up of more neurons. The corticospinal tract is made up of two neurons. The order basically determines the order in which information is carried in. The information for motor movement, for movement of the musculoskeletal system, is generated in the cerebral hemispheres. So that is where the information starts from. And the first order neuron is the one that is found in the cerebral hemispheres, i.e. it is the neurons that start the pathway, that carry the information first, and then they synapse with the second order neuron that pass on the information in the form of electricity, in the form of action potentials, obviously, and then the information goes on from the second order neuron to the skeletal muscles, which are the executors, which will bring about the specific motor movement which we want to carry out. So, first order neuron in the lateral corticospinal tract, they are the upper motor neurons, as they are also called, and they have their cell body in the primary motor cortex. They descend ipsilateral through the posterior limb of the internal capsule and cerebral peduncle. These are parts of the brain which you need to be familiar with in neuroanatomy, and they take a seat at the caudal medulla, lower portion of the medulla. Specific region is also known as the pyramidal decussation, and then they descend contralaterally in the spinal cord, as we already said. Where is the first synapse? It is found in the spinal cord, in the anterior horns of the spinal cord. It is where the first order neuron synapses with the second order neuron, which is also known as the lower motor neuron, and has its cell body in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So second order neuron, lower motor neuron, after it receives the signal, it leaves the spinal cord through the ventral roots, and it contributes to the formation of the spinal nerves and then the different plexi. And then finally, where is the second synapse? It is found on the skeletal muscle. It is where the lower motor neuron comes in contact with the skeletal muscle and it communicates with it, and this specific region where this communication occurs is called the neuromuscular junction, also known as the motor end plate. Synapse, just as a reminder, means where two neurons or a neuron and an effector communicate through chemical means. Okay, so the electrical form of the message which is carried in the neuron will, for a short amount of time, for a short distance, be transformed into a chemical message, which will be a neurotransmitter, and then that's how through the synapse the message will be passed on from the first cell to the second cell. On this slide we have a table similar to the previous one, but now we will summarize a complete course of the anterior instead of the lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, so name of the tract, anterior corticospinal tract, function, voluntary movement of ipsilateral part of the core, then first order neuron, upper motor neurons with their cell body in the primary motor cortex descending ipsilaterally through the posterior limb of the internal capsule and the cerebral peduncle, and then descending again ipsilaterally in the spinal cord, therefore no crossing, no participation in the pyramidal decussation. First synapse, where is it? It is in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. It is where the first order neuron, the upper motor neuron, synapses with the second order neuron, the lower motor neuron. So this helps us with the next part of the table. What is the second order neuron? It is the lower motor neuron leaving the spinal cord through the ventral roots. And then second synapse, once again, it is the neuromuscular junction where the lower motor neuron communicates with the skeletal muscle that we're interested in. On this slide, you can find a picture of the motor homunculus. Now, what is this? This is basically a topographic representation of the body parts along the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. So the precentral gyrus, which is the place of the primary motor cortex, is found in the frontal lobe of the brain. We have obviously two frontal lobes and therefore two precentral gyri and therefore two primary motor cortices, a right and a left one, and on each side, if you make a coronal section of the brain, you can see that the different body parts are represented on the brain in this specific manner. So the most medial part of the precentral gyrus will generate information to facilitate the movement of the toes. So basically, neurons that will end up on skeletal muscles moving the toes will begin from that section of the brain where you see the label toes. Then neurons which will end up on skeletal muscles which will move the ankle will begin their pathway out of the cortical spinal tract at the location of the precentral gyrus where you see the label ankle. Again, for the knee, the neurons which will end up on the skeletal muscles which facilitate movement of the knee will begin their pathway from that specific location of the precentral gyrus where on this picture you see the label knee, and it goes on and on. Now, another thing that you can notice in this picture is that the mouth and the tongue and the hands are bigger in size relative to the toes in a ratio that is not representative of how it really is in life. So your hands are not so much bigger than your toes, and this is because the size represents how many neurons there are for that part of the body and how many types of movements and how fine these movements are. So how complex the ability of the brain to generate movement is for that specific part of the body. So you can see that the face and the hand can do a lot more types of movements and much more complex movements than the ankle, for example. I'm sure you know that your ankle can do a very limited number of movements, right? But you can do a lot with your face. You can laugh, you can smile, you can frown, you can stick your tongue out, you can do so many different types of things. And the same with your hand. You can play an instrument, you can write. It's a lot more complicated. So that's where the different sizes come in. And another detail that I would like to mention just for your information is that the area that is colored light green is being supplied with blood by the anterior cerebral artery. The area that is colored in a darker green color is being supplied with blood by the middle cerebral artery, and then the part which is colored blue in this specific picture, which does not involve the motor homunculus, is being supplied with blood by the posterior cerebral artery. This is also information that you will need to know as part of your neuroanatomy course and obviously later on as well. On this slide, you can see histological cross-section of the spinal cord. You can see a lot of parts of the spinal cord, but I have underlined here for you the lateral corticospinal tract, and the anterior corticospinal tract is not indicated, but you can try to imagine where you will find it based on the diagrams we had on previous slides. Go through everything, as the rest is also important. Now that we have officially finished with the neuroanatomy component of this topic, we will move on to the lesions which affect the spinal motor pathways. Some of the diseases which I will talk about are genetic diseases, some are infectious, some are autoimmune, which are multifactorial, and then we can have some lesions due to an injury. So there's a big variety of pathologies you will find in this section, and they're all important and good for you to have in mind and later on understand even better. The first disease which I will mention is spinal muscular atrophy. This is a congenital disease. It is genetically inherited, and it basically involves degeneration of the neurons who have their cell body in the anterior horn of the spinal cord with time. So basically what you will see in the patient is lower motor neuron symptoms. I will not talk about this in detail because there is not enough time, but you do need to know what the lower motor neuron symptoms are. So lower motor neuron symptoms will be seen symmetrically on both sides. And another detail for you is that an autosomal recessive mutation of the SMN1 gene has been has been found to be relevant to this disease. And then you can see the area affected in the small diagram added on this slide. The next disease is called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It is also known as low Gehring disease, and the difference between this disease and the previous one is that in this disease both upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons are affected. Therefore, motor neurons that are found both in the corticospinal tract as first order and second order neurons are affected. The neurons that have their cell body both in the anterior horn and in the precentral gyrus. So again, it is a disease that involves the generation of motor neurons of the corticospinal tract, just like the previous one, but the previous disease which we mentioned only involved the generation of the second order neurons, whereas amyotrophic lateral sclerosis involves the generation of both the first and the second order motor neurons. We have a clinical correlate with the mutation in the gene superoxide dismutase 1. Not necessarily the person who has a disease will have this specific mutation, but many of them do. And this disease is fatal, most often due to respiratory failure, because the diaphragm no longer works and other skeletal muscles involved in respiration at some point do not work sufficiently. Poliomyelitis, it is an infectious disease. It is caused by the poliovirus. The transmission is fecal-oral. That means that an infected person excretes the virus in their feces. Then the feces contaminate water or food you drink or eat that, and then you are infected yourself. The virus then replicates in lymphoid tissue of the oral cavity as well as the small intestine, and then after it multiplies, it spreads by the bloodstream to the CNS and it targets the second order neurons of the spinal motor pathways. So again, it affects the same neurons that the previous disease that we talked about called spinal muscular atrophy does, but this one, poliomyelitis, is an acquired disease, and the first one is a genetic disease. So because the second one is acquired and the amount of degeneration depends on the viral load, clearly there is a bigger variety in the presentation, and clearly you will see involvement of the lower motor neurons asymmetrically. So your right leg may be more severely impaired than the left leg, or your upper extremities may be more severely impaired than your lower extremities, because it's random. Wherever more virus goes and there is more destruction, there you will see the most severe symptoms. I hope this makes sense. The next condition is called Cauda-Equina syndrome. This syndrome involves not only motor symptoms but also sensory symptoms and autonomic symptoms, because the cause is compression of the spinal roots L2 and below. Therefore, any information that is located in that part of the spinal cord is being compromised. The usual cause is an intervertebral disc herniation, and another very common cause is a tumor compressing the spinal cord. So both of these structures are compressing the spinal cord, damaging the spinal cord. You can have radicular pain, also saddle anesthesia, absent knee and ankle reflexes. This is the motor involvement, and loss of bladder and anal sphincter control. This is the autonomic involvement. The articular pain is clearly because the nerves are irritated, because the neurons are irritated. Potentially the neurons in the nerves basically are irritated. And then saddle anesthesia is the loss of sensory function. On this slide, we will talk about Brown-Séquard syndrome. This is a syndrome that is usually caused by an injury, and it involves hemisection of the spinal cord. So imagine at a specific point in the spinal cord, there is damage to one half of it, either the right side or the left, and therefore if you have a lesion at L2, and everything below L2 is affected. The symptoms involve ipsilateral loss of sensation at that lesion level because the sensory information entering from that same side of the body into the spinal cord at that level cannot be transferred anymore because the sensory neurons are being damaged. Then you have ipsilateral lower motor neurons affected at the lesion level because the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons in the anterior horns are being damaged, and those neurons are innervating muscles of that same side of the body. And then you also have ipsilateral upper motor neurons being affected below the lesion, because below the lesion clearly you have upper motor neurons as part of the corticospinal tracts that are traveling and were about to synapse with their corresponding lower motor neurons, but they cannot do that now because they're damaged. So you have upper motor neurons related symptoms below the lesion, whereas you have lower motor neuron related symptoms at the lesion level. Then you have ipsilateral loss of proprioception, vibration, and light touch below the lesion because there is damage of the posterior columns, which transfer this type of information in the spinal cord from the same corresponding side of the body. And you have contralateral loss of pain, temperature, and crude touch below the lesion. This involves the damage of the spinothalamic tracts in that specific part of the spinal cord which is affected, which is transferring sensory information from the opposite side of the body, because this information has already crossed before the neurons can start traveling up in the spinothalamic tract. And finally, if the lesion is above T1, it means it involves the autonomic neurons of the thoracic level of the sympathetic system. Therefore, you will have ipsilateral Horner syndrome. This is a constellation of symptoms which characterize loss of function of these specific neurons. On this slide, we'll talk about strokes which involve the motor pathways of the spinal cord. A stroke is basically an event where CNS cells die because of lack of supply of oxygen and other nutrients, which can happen because of occlusion of the artery supplying that specific area of the central nervous system, as well as a hemorrhage of the relevant artery. The arteries which we'll talk about are the basilar artery and the anterior spinal artery, because these arteries supply blood to various parts of the central nervous system involving a certain component of the corticospinal tract. So let's start with the basilar artery. It is found in the area of the pons, and it supplies blood to various structures, as we said, but part of the area which it supplies involves a section of the corticospinal tract. So the corticospinal tract passes through the area supplied by the basilar artery. If the basilar artery is occluded, for example, and no blood, oxygen, and nutrients are supplied to the relevant area, the corticospinal tract at that specific point will be impaired, and therefore the function of the corticospinal tract as a whole will be impaired. The symptoms will be quadriplegia because the basilar artery is found so high in the CNS. Its occlusion will impair supply of blood to all the neurons of the corticospinal tract, so you will not be able to move any of your limbs or any of your skeletal muscles, in fact. The next artery which I would like to talk about is the anterior spinal artery. This supplies various parts of the central nervous system, including the medulla, and if the anterior spinal artery is affected, there will be impairment of the corticospinal tract before the decussation. Therefore, if the right part of the corticospinal tract will be affected, you will have impairment of the contralateral, therefore the left upper and lower limbs. So this is an important detail to make sure you understand. If you remember the anatomy, then it will make sense. Finally, I would like to mention multiple sclerosis. This is an autoimmune, inflammatory and demyelinating disease of the central nervous system, and with time you will see that the demyelination of the neurons results in damage and death of the axons of the neurons themselves. Therefore, not only the oligodendrocytes are dying, but also the neurons themselves. Since multiple sclerosis can affect any part of the CNS, it can also affect the spinal cord, and therefore it can also affect any of the pathways inside the spinal cord. Therefore, it can affect the corticospinal tract. Here I have included some of the spinal cord syndromes involved in multiple sclerosis, and an example of a syndrome which can be caused because of damage to the corticospinal tract specifically is paraparesis, and you can see some sensory and some autoimmune symptoms being mentioned here as well.